Originally worn for head protection, military head coverings have long been an essential part of a soldier's uniform. Our story begins 300 years ago, during the American War of Independence, where the famous three-cornered cocked hat was a common piece of wear. This English-introduced hat continued use through the end of the Revolutionary War. By the time George Washington reached the presidency, the three-sided tricorn had evolved into a chapeau bras, a similar hat with two sides folded up. In 1787, regulations prescribed cocked hats for enlisted and officers with trimmings according to their branch. Black leather cockades and feathers were worn on these covers, evolving into plumes that identified rank and assignment. The arc shape of this cover remained until 1840, when the front and end formed points and the brim was heightened at the crown. This provided flexibility to the hat, allowing it to be carried flat under the arm. Another headgear found in the early years at the close of the Revolution was the leather helmet. Originally worn mainly by mounted troops looking for protection from tree limbs and sword blows, it was worn periodically by various units, such as the Dragoons in 1800 through the War of 1812. During the period that the leather cap was utilized by distinct units, the infantry wore cylindrical caps. These were made of felt from 1811 to 1813, moving to leather for more durability. All branches of the regular army adopted this cap in 1816, worn with a cap plate, a colored pompon, and a small leather cockade. In 1821, this cap was replaced with a bell-crowned cap that all enlisted men and company officers wore. This was again adorned with a cap plate as well as a cutout regimental number. Pompons were worn based on branch. In 1832, a straight cylindrical cap replaced the bell-crowned cap for everyone but dragoon soldiers. It was adorned with an outline eagle, branch device, and plumes at the cap's front. The general appearance of this cap was still much like those of the past, with the only major changes being the insignia that soldiers wore on it. The dragoons wore a dress cap of generally the same cut, with a slightly narrower top. Finally, during the Civil War, the last of the cylindrical caps made an appearance, worn by artillery with crossed cannons and an eagle to replace the old pattern cap. It was in this period that a less decorative cap used for practicality began to appear, referred to as the Forage Cap. From 1825 until 1832, soldiers wore a cloth forage cap with their company letter or regimental number for officers. This was briefly updated in 1832 to a leather forage cap, which lasted until 1839, where it was reverted to the cloth material, lasting until 1851, when it was eliminated. But do not fret, it came back just 7 years later, in 1858, with a branch-colored welt around the crown. By the Civil War, this forage cap was a solid dark blue color. Uniform regulations in 1872 introduced a chasseur pattern, giving it a shorter appearance with more of a slanting round top and rigid shape. In 1851, the dress cap pattern was changed from a tall cylindrical form to a smaller shako. A colored pompon was worn with a wide colored band detailing the soldier's branch, which were eliminated in 1854 and replaced with just a colored welt. The next year, the famous Hardee hat was created, worn by cavalry regiments. In 1858, a modified version was prescribed for all branches. Throughout the Civil War, field use adoption created many variations of this dress hat. With the new uniform regulations adopted in 1872, an entirely new set of Army uniforms were created. With that came even more advancements to soldiers' headgear. One new uniform part was a dress cap that resembled a stiffer version of the Forage cap, worn with an eagle and branch insignia. Mounted troops received black felt helmets modeled after English Horse Guard helmets. In 1881, these helmets were expanded to the rest of the Army branches, minus the general and staff officers. Branch-colored plumes were worn on the helmet tops, with foot troops wearing spikes. Experiments began in 1875 to introduce a white version of this helmet, with eventually a white and khaki version being authorized for wear without front insignia. The majority of these helmets were replaced in the early 1900s with the new Visor Cap. It was in 1895 when the modern-day Visor Cap first started making an appearance. A new version of the dark blue Forage Cap came into use, with officers wearing mohair braid around the base and a gold bullion cord. Enlisted wore a metal branch insignia and a leather chin strap. Expanded use of white caps happened in 1900, matching the current look of the Visor Cap. A new uniform in 1902 resulted in minor changes to this cap with a slightly flared crown. This flare was then increased every few years before World War I. In 1905, olive drab and khaki versions were introduced for their respective uniforms. Besides changes to the minor design details and insignia, the post-World War I form of this cap is still used today. Another change that came with the 1872 uniform regulations was the introduction of a soft, wide-brimmed campaign hat. This initial failure resulted in a stiffer brimmed model 4 years later, and by 1883 a tan version had been established. Soldiers began to wear campaign cords on these hats based on their branch. In 1911, a crown crease was replaced with the 4-indentation Montana peak. Various versions of these campaign hats were worn until World War II. It saw wide but unofficial use after World War II, until it made a revival in the mid-1960s as a drill sergeant hat. Cavalry units in Vietnam also wore black campaign hats, and these were adopted as calf hats by certain cavalry units in the 1970s. As America entered the world wars of the 20th century, yet again a modern approach to uniforms was established, requiring a change to the headgear of their soldiers. The first of these was the overseas cap, an article of clothing that could replace the combat helmet when its use was deemed unnecessary. It also needed to be shaped in a way where it wouldn't easily be crushed. Many different patterns and cuts existed, with most of the early caps being made in Europe. This cap was discarded in favor of the campaign hat and visor cap at the end of World War I. However, it was slowly revived in the interwar period with soldiers of the Air Corps. Yet the need still remained for a type of headgear that took such little space. It became known as the Garrison Cap in 1940, and even though the cut has varied throughout the years, the general shape is still relevant. During World War I, the British steel helmet was found to not provide adequate protection. By the Second World War, the United States Army had replaced it with a two-piece helmet set that provided better protection and more forming, known as the M1 helmet. This helmet remained in use during the Vietnam War with minor changes. It was eventually phased out in the early 1980s, replaced with a Kevlar helmet. This again was replaced with the modern-day Advanced Combat Helmet in 2003 that is still in use today. Additional fatigue caps were also introduced in the World War I era, the first of which was the denim hat, a soft-crowned, soft-brimmed hat that lived until the early part of the Second World War, when it would be eventually replaced with a cotton khaki field hat until the birth of the olive drab herringbone twill uniform with its own cap version. A soft-billed HBT cap was also issued for those who wore one-piece HBTs. Together with the M43 field cap, these billed fatigue caps persist in necessity today. In 1951, a new version of the billed field cap was adopted, which many soldiers soon participated in the practice of fixing the sides to remain stiff. Other minor changes continued to be made to fatigue caps, mirroring the uniform changes that came about. However, the general shape remains largely the same today. During and after the World War II period, additional forms of specialized headgear were created. Sun helmets used in tropical climates were worn in white, khaki, and olive green shades through the 1970s. A popular wool knit cap was introduced in 1941 for cold weather conditions, sometimes referred to as a Jeep cap. Other headgear popularized during the Vietnam War included the hot weather or tropical hat, commonly called bush or boonie hats. It was in 1955 when the U.S. Army Special Forces adopted the beret, with wear being seen across various units. By 1979, Army policy enforced regulations on this beret, with airborne and ranger units authorized black berets, and Special Forces authorized green berets. The covers of the U.S. Army today all find their origins somewhere in the past, with the helmets, caps, and hats all rooted in historical developments. The modern-day patrol cap has distinct features similar to the fatigue cap of yesterday. The Visor Cap, Garrison Cap, helmet, and berets all take root from the developments of the 20th century. Soldiers today honor the tradition of the past with their headgear, and future improvements may warrant a new type of cover in the future.